live now, and I will do the thing that I do at the start of every live stream, which is say, I'm doing the thing that everybody does at the start of every live stream, which is say, now we just wait for people to get here. And I should also tweet it, which I also do live every time in a very silly way.
It's the only way to do it. Otherwise, it's not a real live stream.
Yeah. It's like the secret password that you need to do to actually count. Oh, no, I just said quote. I quote tweeted the tweet to be like, we're live now, but I accidentally just typed quote tweet.
I'm a manual coder. Oh man.
I'm glad that I looked at that because it would have just been sitting there for an hour, me quote tweeting the tweet and saying quote tweet.
Maybe people would have thought you were being kind of like ironic.
Yeah, just being like, yeah.
Oh, that's just Taylor. Taylor's so random.
Yeah, it's like ironic self-promotion, you know?
Yeah. Do you think random is going to come back around? Like, you know how everything's...
Yeah.
I think randomness is kind of, timeline-wise, randomness should be really coming in now.
Yeah, I wonder, the thing that I've been seeing on TikTok is core, which is like all of the aesthetics converging upon each other in like a very like Dadaist way. I'm like, is this now when we go like RAR XD? Right.
Equal sign, close bracket. Yeah, maybe. Who knows? I keep seeing everyone's takes on what fashion and stuff is going to do, and I'm really enjoying this idea that it's like nostalgic but also very futurist, in a very kind of 50s like visual way, like collage of 50s stuff. So that's fun. I don't know.
Yeah, this is my year of, I've been getting really into fashion TikTok, but not in the like, here's my Shein haul fashion TikTok. Like I'm going to develop the most specific personal style.
Yes.
Like, oh, I would like to be that. I would like to do that. So
I really enjoy people showing how they put their outfits together as well. And like, or just like, I saw this idea, so I decided to make it out of a throw that I found in a thrift store and this old thread that I had.
Yeah. I feel like we have just naturally, in talking about TikTok while people filter in, and now we're sort of reaching a quorum, worked our way into the chapters on like adornment and the pleasure of
Definitely.
Hello everyone. Now there are enough people filtering in and saying hi in the chat. Please say hello in the chat so we know who you are here. I am here with Rosianna Haas-Rojas, who has joined us for this final installment of season 1 of the Hopepunk Book Club to discuss pleasure activism. Rosianna, oh, nice.
I've got one of those too.
We read the book. Would you like to tell folks who you are, where they can find you? I think most people will know you, but it's like we're a small world of vintage YouTubers here.
Yeah, we're a little circle. Yeah, so I'm a writer and film producer, but I also still make a lot of random internet stuff. Now random is going to find its way back into my own vocabulary, right? And yeah, so I've been making YouTube videos in theory since 2006. Kind of been putting it on pause a bit lately, but still got the itch to come back. And just doing things on Instagram and TikTok, just as and when the wind blows that way. Usually when I'm at a Killer's gig, because that's my form of true happiness.
Excellent. Yeah. There are also links in the description of this video if you would like to find Rosianna's various accounts. Today, I feel like this is a unique installment of Hopepunk Book Club, because when I was emailing my friends and asking what people wanted to read, I had sort of a short list, and you were like, how about pleasure activism, which was not on my list. I had read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, but this one came entirely from you. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about why you wanted to read this book specifically.
Yeah, so I was given pleasure activism as a gift from my sister. I've got two sisters, and the elder sister gave me, I think it was a birthday several years ago. And it was very interesting because neither of my sisters are big readers. And only lately has that elder sister been getting into activism and theoretical reading. And I think had also felt kind of excluded from that world, but has now found this wonderful path through books that are really resonating with her and just loving the ones to which she loves them. It's really exciting to see because she'll just like talk about them all the time, which is obviously, you know, something that I've been really familiar with for a long time, but I never connected with my family about. So that's been really nice. So yeah, she gave it to me and she was like, just, you know, have a read of it and see what you think. And for me, it was quite transformative. Like I grew up in a very pleasure restricted household, I suppose I'd say, where pleasure wasn't really considered as important, or more crucially, it was considered sort of deviant or like to its detriment of anything valuable. So that was one perspective. But then also, I love the way that Adrienne Maree Brown and all the theorists that she refers to talks about activism and pleasure activism in community. And I particularly love the idea of sistering that comes into the book, and how that as a verb and as something that you practice. I think that pleasure can be regarded in the way that my family regarded it, which is like very sort of passive and trite and superfluous, and at its worst, like actually corrosive. But it's not even the inverse of that. It's just like a completely different way of thinking about pleasure and about connection, about what we all need. And the other thing is that the reason I chose it is because I think a lot of us, when we have these conversations about what we want the world to look like or how we want things to feel, it's easy or familiar often not to make room for pleasure and not to think about pleasure, to talk about problems but not talk about how communities find joy, or the joy in connecting to communities or in playing with different things. Or you know, also I'm British, like we don't really talk about sex. Like sex gets left off the table and we sort of give it a little side eye and we're like so to have a space, a text, conversation starter for that, that also introduces all of these wonderful theorists and just different people who have like resonated with this idea of pleasure activism, make it such a key one for me.
Yeah, I found it interesting because I think similarly, you know, the Midwestern American kind of Protestant work ethic and all of that, and I was also raised Catholic, and you know, with a very generous dose of guilt and shame, pleasure, sort of suffused in my life. Like I remember, you know, as I was reading this, we read a number of books through this book club that have challenged me and sort of introduced new ideas. But this was the most challenging for me to read because as I started reading it, I was like, you know, like even though it's been a long time since I've identified with any sort of Catholicism, I'm like, about sex on the internet. You know, I was like, how am I going to do this? But also that is, you know, I really resonated with the ideas of like, you know, activism sort of feeling like, oh, we're doing this noble suffering and we have to work ourselves, you know, past the point of exhaustion to prove that we're virtuous. And like, oh, well, no wonder that people don't want to join movements. We make it seem like a miserable time.
And when I think of movements, like that's actually, you know, the joy of it is so much what keeps me going. You know, when I go to protests and that relief and release of it and the creativity of coming up with different actions and all of that, like that's such a and the joy of learning, even when it's learning that makes you so angry or so like deeply engaged in it, there is still pleasure in it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I also was brought up Catholic, and I think that so much of that was this very, at least in kind of my experience of it, was a very suffering focused, suffering essential way of growing up, and way of thinking about things that I'm still like unpicking so much of.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I remember when I was, um, you know, organizing a full-time job in a very sort of demanding schedule, kind of like where we got to do this. It's, we've got to save democracy and blah, blah, blah. That like we had sort of a planning meeting and a speaker came in and was like, okay, yes, we've got to make all these plans and do all this work, but also do it with joy. Like wake up every morning and be like, I get to do this and not like everything is falling apart. Which is also something there was a lot in here about like we do need to give people um, something to be excited about and look forward to, and not just we have to stop the walls from crumbling down. That I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this is a very accurate picture of American politics right now, where it's like, would you like to be a white supremacist, or would you like to kind of try to hold that back from happening? But there's no vision of like, or we could achieve, like we could
Yeah.
achieve a nice thing. It's just sort of like stop bad.
Like
But
it's like, what are we walking towards? What are we
mhm,
choosing? What are we offering? And I think that's the same issue in politics here in the UK, and that's a big reason why there hasn't been the like political shift that we're many of us are hoping for, is because so much of it has been about like stop this or hold up against this, but none of it, or not enough of it on scale, has been about what could it be. And I think that we can also here again also be kind of resistant sometimes to ideas of like communities of care or communities of hope and joy and pleasure and just different ways of doing things. Um, but yeah, it's also, I think, something that was very interesting about reading this, with that in mind, was seeing the past, I don't know, decade, couple of decades, but especially the past decade, as like a very specific moment in time with very specific attitudes towards activism and suffering and coming together in different ways, but then also individualism and our very individual responses to what's going on, in a way that I don't think I have been able to look at the like 2010s before,
yeah.
um, because we were just in them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that that feels very accurate, that this was just sort of sort of feeling like walking around to the other side of the microscope and being like,
Mhm.
oh. um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think we're kind of circling around the central question of Hopepunk Book Club, which I would love to hear your sort of distilled thoughts on, after kind of all of this, sort of seeing it shine a light on these parts of ourselves that we're like, oh, what does this book make you believe about the future? And also, folks in chat, if you read this and have something that this book made you believe about the future, we'd love to hear your responses too.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question so much. When he sent it in the email, I was like, "Oh, what a great question." I think for me, it made me think about, both in like a personal and community sense, that the future like must have space for pleasure, and specifically pleasure, um, in all its different forms, whether that's, pleasure in sex and relationships and friendships and love, and then also pleasure in work, pleasure in protest, pleasure in um, living, pleasure in struggle, all of it. Like there must be space for it, and it must be um, kind of explicitly voiced, I suppose.
Mhm.
I definitely feel like over the last several years, I've been sort of learning and practicing identifying and expressing needs, and that's definitely a big unworking of what I've learned. And I think including space for pleasure in that is really important. I was really moved by all the different ways the book accounts for the different, I don't know what the word would be, the different almost like pleasure rituals or like body
Mm.
work rituals or breath work rituals that were incorporated into situations of activism or just conversations between academics and collaborators and so on. Um, and I think that that is such a good example of how pleasure has to have an important role in
Mm.
every aspect of our lives, because it's kind of like, oh, I never would have thought about doing, call and response, doing that kind of chanting in that kind of pleasure centered way.
Mhm.
But that is also part of it. So yeah, I think what makes me believe, like we as we are holding all these big concepts in our minds and these big thoughts about like what we want the future to look like pleasure needs to be given an important role and not just kind of relegated to the sidelines or forgotten or seen as secondary even. Like it
Mm.
informs everything that we can hope for in as much as anything else. Yeah.
That, yeah, I think for me, I imagine something similar, which is it actually brought me back to an interview with a researcher, Sarah Jaquette Ray, who writes about climate anxiety, and I interviewed her on my channel almost 2 years back, and I sort of was like, okay, what's the question you would leave folks with who are trying to address climate change? And she said, what would it make to make the future? What would it take to make the future desirable?
Mm,
And that's been a question that's really been kind of a guiding force for me over the past few years. But I feel like reading this book made that question a lot juicier.
yeah.
In that I was sort of like, okay, so that shifted for me that the future isn't necessarily we're sliding down a slope of suffering and more suffering and more suffering. Like, oh, we could actually arrive at a place where things are good, where things are better than they are now.
Yeah.
Um, but not just, oh, we could actually, kind of stumble into goodness, but that we actually have the ability to make a future that is like desirable in the juicy way, like that you would yearn for it, that you would, you know, really want it, not just sort of like, like purely the opposite of dread, like
Yeah.
actual desire. And I was like, oh, desire is a very specific word that I read differently having read this book now. So I think that you're right, like that the future could be desirable, but also that we have to make that desire front and center, that we need to like, she was quoting Tony Cade Bambera a lot of like the purpose of art is to make the revolution irresistible, right? That we need to make space for building in that desire, so that because without it we can't get there. If we don't yearn for it, we can't build it.
Yeah, I mean, desire is such an interesting word as well, because every time desire would come up or things close to it, I would feel this sort of like inner shame of like, oh, but we can't talk about our desires. God
Mhm.
forbid, heaven forfend. And I think you're so right. I think that, yeah,
Yeah.
the future, the revolution, the hope as having space for desire, but even within ourselves, yeah, and even admitting to ourselves that desire is important.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm seeing John Titus in the chat pin something really important, which is this made me see pleasure as an active part of activism and change, and not just a way of recharging to navigate difficulties. I think that's really, really important because, there are some references in the book to Audre Lorde and, who coined the term self care and that self-care has sort of been distorted into this thing of like, wait until you get burned out and then you have to go into your cave and do some self-care, but don't make it a big deal for everyone. Or, buy some sheet masks and go shop yourself into fulfillment. And that it's sort of seen in a lot of movement spaces as, once you've really exhausted yourself, then stop and take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And that it is really important that it be upfront and not just wait until you have burned yourself out of doing this, that you need it first so you don't even get to that point, or so that you have something that keeps you inspired enough to be in it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that like there's so much. It definitely came up in this book, but I think also just when I look at examples among activists and organizers that I know, the sense of, well, we don't have time to be doing the sort of fluffy work of looking after ourselves because right now not enough people are helping out, and there's this very kind of scarcity mindset instead of a more abundant mindset that I think is also what comes out of this book. It's like, if I look at this space and the work and just my approach to it as quite an abundant thing, then that fundamentally changes how I'm going to look after myself, and how I'm going to look after the people around me. But if I think of it as like, time's running out, no one's paying attention, why isn't anyone listening? Which are also, I fully get, like, a completely valid response to everything going on. But I am going to maybe take less care of myself and take less, and other people are going to also look at how I'm treating myself and take that for themselves and have that be, oh, this is how I should be feeling, this is how I should be responding. And actually, yeah, it's quite corrosive and draining to both hope and to the movements themselves.
Yeah, I remember that being a big part of, when I worked in campaigning, there was like this sort of adage of like, well, you don't want to get to the end of this and feel like, well, what if I had done one more thing? What if I had knocked one more door? What if I'd made one more phone call? Whatever. And it was very much like, we've got to go until this finish line and we've got to put every moment that we can. And the thought that I always had was like, well, if I didn't work 16 hours and instead I worked 10, there would be 10 way better hours.
Yeah.
But I've worked myself to such exhaustion that like every one of my hours is, like squeezing from a dry sponge. But that something that's really comforting to me that I've heard, especially from like climate activists, is there actually is no end. That you're like, well, once we get to the end, if we, there's not a cliff that we're driving off of. This is the work of the rest of our lives. And so if you think, I have the rest of my life to do this, not that I'm going to wait until the very last day, but like, I'm going to be working on this forever. And so I need to pace myself accordingly. Actually, it takes some of the heat off in a way that actually makes it possible to sustain that distance.
Yeah, and it also just that example, which is just all too familiar to me as well, but it really makes me think of the sort of lie of the American dream, right? Or like, or it also makes me picture like American high school athletes like you see in TV, like One Tree Hill or whatever. And that idea, like, if you just worked harder and you just pushed yourself, then you could have got to where you wanted to be, and it's your fault that you didn't. Not taking into context anything else around it, but also, as you say, like, this is the work of a lifetime, and the idea that you can achieve something, I don't know, like this sort of accoladed heroic moment, actually kind of not defeats, maybe that's too strong, but that might not be actually what it is you want. It's rather what you've been told success looks like. So, I mean, that's also part of it, I think, is reframing that, and whether success as a word is even a goal, or even part of the conversation. And as you say, it's the work of a lifetime. It's like a lot of it is slow. A lot of it is not going to feel like progress, and the things that do are going to feel particularly special, but then also sometimes fragile in those ways.
Mm.
But it's because it's very difficult to zoom all the way out and see all the little bits of work, partly because, especially in US and UK societies, the people that have been celebrated have been the individuals, and in a very abbreviated and sometimes completely twisted version of what actually their lives were like and what they involved and all of that. So like I have a lot of compassion for the way I certainly used to like look at things like achievement and activism and these like short-term ways. But as you say, like 10 good hours, much better.
Mhm.
5 great hours, the best.
Yeah, that's why like I've talked about this in these book club live streams before, but it's not like an idea that is really, really important to me right now is that an activist is not a type of person that like I feel like people they hear that word and they think, and also the way that it gets depicted on TV a lot is like this person who shows up to dinner and tells you why everything that you're serving is like, contributing to human rights abuses and things like that, where it's just like their job is to show up and kill the fun. And every moment of their lives, they're doing a justice. But it's like, it's actually, it takes all of us doing a little bit on the weekend or a bit after work or interspersed with the regular lives that we live. That it's all of our jobs to do a little of it. And it's not just a type of person that you are either called to be or you're not.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think I saw a comment earlier that was about hang on, let me find it. Oh yeah, from Ava Holick 96. It said, I think one of the biggest barriers to attracting new people to progressive causes is the sense that such movements lack any semblance of pleasure or joy. And I think that that's a big part of it, is that for people who have a different relationship to pleasure and joy than I do, they also haven't been able to see themselves in a lot of the movements because they think that it's one or the other. It's like pleasure and joy or it's activism. It cannot be pleasure and joy and activism. And that I think can create quite an avoidant dynamic. Like, I don't want to look at these causes, I don't want to look at these communities, I don't want to look at these groups, because to do so, I will have to put this down. And I know that there is something valuable in that. And I think that it can be quite like tempting or easy to be like, oh, you're just not prioritizing the important things. But actually, like, there is something important in prioritizing pleasure and joy. It's just they haven't found that reflected within the kind of activism spaces or just approaches to community engagement that they've been exposed to. So I think it made me a little less judgmental. In general, I am trying to move towards becoming an increasingly less judgmental person. But again, that Catholicism, man, I've got to unpick it.
Yeah, it makes me think about that too, because I'm like, well, yes, but it's the right and proper thing to suffer, and so you should just do it anyway.
Yeah.
But it's bringing it back around to fashion, just because I'm also trying to get myself to not see this interest of mine as frivolous and silly. And as we read, that's a form of pleasure, is in presenting yourself to the world in a way that you want to be seen, and taking pleasure in decorating yourself.
Yeah.
But that's something that I see a lot in, now that I'm following all of these, fashion historians and things like that on social media, is there's this kind of ongoing conversation in the fashion space. You have people who, are really into fast fashion and hauls and all of these things, sort of pushing back against criticism, saying, oh, you shouldn't shop at Shein. Oh, well, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, and I want to look good, so I'm just going to do this anyway. And saying, all right, I understand why you feel this way, but also, rather than saying, all right, the alternative is suffering, is I can't afford clothes, or I can't look good, or I can't present myself in the way that I want to. Is there a different sort of pleasure that we can seek? Is re-wearing a favorite sweater over and over and making it a signature item, is that a kind of pleasure? Is hunting something down at a thrift shop for 2 years and then finally finding it, is that a kind of pleasure? So that there's that you can't just substitute, hey, the thing that you're doing is wrong, and therefore you shouldn't have the thing that makes you feel good. Is that we have to, find ways to frame the alternative for people in a way that they can see themselves in it, and see joy and pleasure in it, and not just sort of like, well, I'm telling you to suffer, and if you don't want to suffer, you're a bad person. Like, all right, well, let's find a different way to find you joy, because we do deserve it, and not in a, gosh, I really struggle with this so much, because I do think that there is a sort of a segment of Instagram activism where it's just sort of like, self-care and rest and joy and pull back when it's too much, that can be used as a way to bypass real issues, that people can say, oh, well, you deserve joy, so just anything that feels difficult or you're confronted with a challenge, just run.
It's actually like a kind of opt out. They're like, I'm just going to opt out of this. Fine. But but that now, I see that, I'm like, you're just numbing yourself. Like, that doesn't even seem desirable to me. And I think there are times when I've been really exhausted and drained and burnt out, as we were talking before, when that sort of opt-out has seemed a bit more desirable to me, just because I'm so burnt out and so on. Now I look at that stuff and I'm like, you are missing, I suppose, like, the language I needed is like, you are missing the pleasure and joy of being engaged.
Yeah. That's something I think about too a lot with myself, where I'm like, I'm trying to notice when I'm resting, if I am actually resting. It's like, is watching TikTok for a couple of hours, does this feel good, or does this just feel not like bad? Am I just numbing out something right now? And I'm obviously not perfect. I still do my little scrolls to not feel, but that I think there is a distinction where it's not pleasure, it's just an absence of pain.
But even in that, like, I think, like, you and I are very accustomed to the language of perfection and seeking perfectionism. So I think that it's not about it being perfect or not. It's just like, this doesn't feel good. So I think even in that, like, over time, you'll probably choose something else, and that's a hopeful thing, and that's good too. But yeah, it's just getting back in touch with yourself. I think for me, like, growing up, just having to shut down all these different elements of my own connection with myself, and then actively contributing in that over time, and like, not in positive ways. Like, it's just very it's just a very interesting thing. It's just a very interesting process. But I also am like, it is funny how activism and, just like learning about social issues and social movements is presented as this very harsh, sort of aggressive, killjoy moment. But actually, I think it's the thing that has made me the softest and the kindest, really.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think I identify with that as well. It's the thing that pushes me away from, the kind of balance that I'm trying to find between, I guess it's, do you know the Mitski song, Stay Soft?
Before you even say it, I will say yes. But yes, I do actually. That's actually on one of my dating app profiles, is Stay Soft.
I think like all my social media bios right now are open up your heart like the gates of hell. But yeah, that song is like, I feel like my theme song, because it is just like, I do find myself kind of hardening against the world and the difficulties and the injustice, and being like, well, I keep doing this thing and trying to be tender and trying to be caring and trying to be sincere and earnest. And gosh, being earnest on the internet is not cool at all. I'm just constantly like, here I go, I'm gonna upload an earnest video and like hemorrhage subscribers. But I sometimes I'm like, well, no, I should be tough, I should be hard, I should be you know, I should be angry, I should let myself crust over in my anger. But staying engaged is the thing that keeps me from doing that. Otherwise, I would just be really, you know, spiny.
Yeah, like an echidna.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how I must have been really young. I think I was like 8 or 9, and I was in church, and they printed out the mass sheet, and just like saw what the gospel was going to be that day. And I was just thinking about how there was one week when it was the story of I want to say Moses, maybe potentially Moses, but there's this line in it about how the Pharaoh hardened his heart. And like every time, I think it's the like let my people go.
Yeah.
And it's like the Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again. I remember just reading that language and being like, oh, that's what I do. And that was kind of the only time that I found that in just somewhere to say, please no cross. I think that's the first time, and probably one of the only times I had that experience to a biblical text, where I would just read it and felt like, oh my God, that's what I've been doing. I'm like the little Pharaoh, hardening my heart, just getting kind of like distant. And then of course growing up and understanding that it was protective and I was trying to protect myself. But that, yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it, to kind of look back at how early those behaviors start, and so how you have to like put out your little hand to yourself and be like, okay, we're going to try something else. And in those activism spaces, I think so many people are drawn to activism because they see something that isn't just or fair, and people around them seem to accept it. So I think that also makes sense, like why that would make you look harder, like harden your little heart a little, and kind of make you like put your head down and just get on with stuff, because the people around you don't care and they're supposed to be the adults, you know. So that's, yeah, and that's another thing. I think it's been a real learning for me over the past few years about hierarchy, because like I was brought up in such a hierarchical system in so many different ways, not just in childhood, but also living in a country with a king. Oh, how horrific. But so yeah, embracing these ideas of like flatter structures and sisterhood has taken a lot of work. It does not come second nature to me at all. And I've had to really sort of learn about the ways in which I can sometimes default to hierarchical thinking, especially in work environments. But again, seeing different ways and being in spaces like in detention support groups where they're like, yeah, we don't really have a person in charge. It's just whoever wants to speak first goes. And I'm just like, how could that possibly work?
Yeah, very Quaker. You know, all of this makes me think, and maybe this will bring us back to the sistering as a verb that I know that you want us to talk about. But like that hardening of your heart, that I think that pleasure is one of the protective forces against that. I was talking about in the other room, one of my friends from high school was visiting, and we were talking a lot about, you know, now that we've turned 30, we're kind of like, all right, now what is life? Are we just, is this it? You know, what is it? And, you know, sort of talking about the ways that we've closed down possibility in our lives. So for me, like when I went freelance, I was like, what allowed me to do that was saying to myself, well, I guess I'll just never own a house. And so I'll let go of that dream, and that'll let me do this other thing. And, you know, she was like, oh, well, you know, one of my friends does this exercise where she had to write down 100 things that she wants out of life. And I was like, oh my God, like, I don't know if I can do that. But then also I'm like, oh, it's been my regular practice of shutting down, like, I'll be safer if I don't want anything. Because then I can't get disappointed if I don't get it. But a way to protect ourselves against that hardening of our hearts is to say, like, no, I do want, I want this future. I want to be able to have a home that I can stay in and feel safe in. And I also want to have a job that feels fulfilling. And I also want a livable climate. And I also, want flatter structures and I also want community. Like that wanting is a way to protect ourselves from shutting everything down and shutting everything out.
Yeah, and it's funny because even as you said, like 100 things, there's part of me that was like, oh no, like I couldn't possibly want 100 things. And of course I do. Of course I do. And it's like we all do. But I think it is, again, it's making space for that. And also they're so complementary. Are we posing?
It's time to be real.
I was like, what's happening? Something's happening. Oh, it's
sorry. Because I'm still listening.
I haven't washed my hair today. But yeah, no, it is. It's like, yeah, having space for that, and also understanding it's not even like it's what's the word? It's not even like it's some kind of concession to ourselves. Actually, those wants and needs and pleasures are what's going to help us find the way through. That is a very difficult thing for me to get my head around, but I'm working on it. Yeah,
it's like I say all these things, and of course it's it is not what I am practicing. So we're all working on it.
We're working on it.
I think one thing I wonder a lot about is how do you know when you've found the balance? And it's probably like a constant adjustment, but making sure that you are not trying to identify with suffering for the sake of suffering, but also trying not to use pleasure to bypass or to numb. How do you know when you are using pleasure as a tool for liberation? And I guess for me, the way that I'm thinking about it right now is maybe the barometer I would use is like, is it bringing me closer to community, or is it bringing me closer to isolation? I think about that a lot, like when we talk about self-care and all the ways that it's been distorted. I love a skincare routine. I find great joy in applying my different products in my different steps in my order. Does that bring me closer to community? No, it doesn't. When I go to my virtual meetings for the organizations that I volunteer with, and they play fun music at the beginning, and I'm realizing now that that's not just a sort of a perfunctory thing that they do as people filter in.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, that serves a purpose. And that brings me closer to community and us all talking about, oh yeah, the new Beyonce album came out, and what is everybody's favorite song? That's actually bringing us closer together, and closer to forming bonds with each other. And so maybe that is when you know that your pleasure is pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, well, I think it's both, isn't it? Like, yeah, it's both, because in a way you are in a kind of community when you're doing a skincare routine. You're one of those people who just like, so today on this TikTok, I'm going to talk about social injustice. But it is interesting because I think I never really understood what an art facilitation was until this year. I think I always saw it as something like, oh, people who are charismatic or people who have a certain kind of personality are just particularly good at it. And yeah, that can be true. But also, wow, what collection of skills and approaches and learning and theory and practice it is. Like, so it's funny that you mentioned that, because I've been thinking about that a lot. But I think that is a good barometer about connection. But I also think it goes back to this idea of, are we just trying to sort of achieve balance in the same way that we would sort of tick something off, and so that we don't have to look at it anymore? Or is it, I think it's just going to be something that I'm constantly having to check in with, and that will be easier to get a sense of the more open and vulnerable and engaged I am with the people around me, who feel like they would be able to sort of, call it in, or pass some kind of comment from a place of love. I think that that for me feels very vulnerable, but I think it's part of what I'm moving towards. Is I'm so inclined to isolate myself, but actually the only thing that's ever been reparative is connecting more. Annoyingly.
Isn't it? That's something that I struggle with too. That's the first sort of sign that the wave is coming. Is I'm canceling plans and I'm isolating.
Yeah.
I think you're also exactly right on the point of, you can't just treat it like a box that you have to tick and, yes, I cared for myself. I've done my little self-care. Now I can go on to punishing myself with work all day,
I've done that once, so yeah.
That it actually just sort of needs to be integrated with everything. But how?
When if the approach is everything is integrating with everything, then is that really, I'm like, there's part of that I'm like, is that really a fair expectation to put on myself? But again, I think it's because I'm thinking of it as time is scarce and burdensome, when it's actually, no, it's abundant and it will help and it will support. And that's the thing that's just not built into our sort of cultural structures of approaches to things. Like, time is always short. The stories you hear are so often about, people who are just stressed and running out of time, and you got to do it, things are running out, and it's just, yeah, it's a huge shift that I have not yet made, but seek to.
Yeah, there was that book that was really popular for a while, 4,000 Weeks, and I read it and I was just like, this has ruined me. Like, I think it's a very admirable message of like, well, you don't have infinite time, so like, don't tell yourself that you're going to do everything, and just focus on what actually matters to you. But also, I do like the way you're framing it much better, which is just like, time is abundant and we are here for a while and we're going to be here for a while. So stop trying to, I think that's exactly, the conversation I was having with my friend before, which is just like, we got to 30 and we were sort of like, we had this idea in our head that we had to cram in all of our dreams before this deadline. And now we're sitting here going, all right, well, we're like a third of the way through our lives.
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah. We've got all this time. We have all the time in the world. Yeah, and I think for me also, what's been really revealing is like, I don't know if I'll have kids at any point, and it's not something that's like in my plan, but seeing the different ways people still speak to me around that sense of like, oh, it's urgent, it's scarce, so you have to move along now, you have to do this, you have to do that. I'm like, wow, you are so in a different place. And I don't want to disregard like the feeling of time pressure and all of that, because it is very, like, in some ways I can fully relate to it, but then in other ways I'm like, why are you taking the oxygen out of the room? Like, I'm trying to just breathe and go on with things, and you're just trying to make it feel like, no, this is a panic situation, and it's just, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to.
Like, how can we get to a place of more possibility and not less?
Yeah.
Where are we getting to a place where things are opening up and it's not just the walls closing in around you? Yeah. And oh boy, I'm like, I have work to do on that.
All right, time's up. No, it's like, I don't know, the thing I keep picturing is just like standing outside and just like stretching and just being like, gosh, we have so much room. And there's so much room. And I think about that a lot, because a lot of my work outside of film and YouTube stuff is with the refugee communities and talking about migration and mobility and all of that. And part of the way in which these anti-migrant, anti-refugee conversations gain so much traction is by pushing scarcity. There's not enough for everyone. There's not enough for, working class people and refugees. There's not enough space. There's not enough money. There's not enough NHS and all of that. But actually, it's making me think and making me realize that a lot of what's helped me counter that is this idea of abundance. And there's so much space. There's so many resources. There's so much support there. It's always interesting to contrast the way newspapers and so on will talk about refugees and then look at like this organization, British Futures, does all this constant polling on how people in the UK are feeling about it. It's always overwhelmingly in support, like 60% plus, like fully in favor. And so it's just kind of rejecting this narrative of scarcity and of compression, I think is really central. And it goes back to that idea of, if there is abundance, there is space for pleasure and whatever else it is that we need to feel. Like we don't have to become these activism robots. But then burn out, snap, and buy a candle. Like it's,
that there's space for all of it. Yeah. And also that there's, to your point about scarcity and resources, like how much pleasure there is in being able to share. I think that's a great joy of reaching a place in my 30s where, like, I feel like when I was 22 and nobody had anything and we all still were like, let's split a pizza and sit on the floor, and it doesn't matter if nobody has chairs, but also like what a pleasure it is to, be able to treat somebody to dinner or go out and not have to worry about who's covering what and just be like, I just want to be here with you and share with you. What a pleasure and what a joy that is. And we can do that on a macro scale too.
Totally. And like, it's so fun to be able to say to people like, oh yeah, I've got room. You can come, or like, you should come with us. Or I don't know, I found like there always is a way to make it work. Like it's such a strange lie that there's just not enough. Like there's so much. There's so much. And that's in as much with like resources as it is with kind of human capacity to engage with something or respond to something. And I think that's partly because we've been like taught, or we've learned that the best response is to like shut ourselves down, but that hasn't really worked for any of us. So yeah, I don't know. It's a real journey, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd love to hear in the chat if other folks have thoughts here about how we can get to that future where there is room for pleasure, how we make room for it, how we can be intentional about it. See Colin Barrow C in the chat saying public spaces like parks are really important for sharing too, somewhere the whole community can have pleasure for free rather than private spaces that include people. There's the concept of the third place that I feel like makes the social media rounds every so often, where it's like, oh, we do need places that we can gather, and there doesn't, or parks and libraries are really all that we have for being able to go out in public and not have to spend money for the privilege of being somewhere. Without that sort of common space, we don't actually have the ability to be in community if people are excluded, from participation for, the price of admission. And that so interesting that no matter, what your socioeconomic status, being in those places that are openly accessible are some of our favorite places,
Yeah.
So we instinctively know that we should all, have this access and how good it feels to be in a place where people truly do.
Yeah, that's really true. I'm just thinking about how in the UK it's like you've got parks, you've got libraries, you've got the British Museum. But that's interesting to me because it's like, oh, you think, you think that's important. And like, I love that we have free museum access in the UK, but it is interesting to think about why access to that museum in particular is seen as something that should be free.
Yeah, we have that too in America. It's like most museums aren't free, but all the Smithsonian, all of the ones that you see that are part of the sort of national myth making, they're like, that's free. I'm like, okay.
I was like, just go to the Tate instead. Just go to the Tate for all its problems. Yeah. Wow.
So as we close, any other last thoughts? I know that we didn't get too much into sistering as a verb, but
yeah, no, I mean, I love this book. I'm really glad that we could read it together, and I just encourage you to sort of like dip in and out of it as you go back to it, because that's definitely been my relationship with it. It's never really been, oh, I'll read the whole thing again. And in fact, rereading it for this was like the first time in a while I'd read it like start to finish again. It's so great to have this almost pleasure reader to go back into and find, all of these primarily Black women theorists who, there are a few that you hear so many references to in the mainstream, but to have this breadth of work and these conversations between theorists and between contemporary theorists, I think is so wonderful. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'd say. Also, Adrienne Marie Brown has such a great Instagram where she posts memes all the time. So also follow her on Instagram.
Do that. Yeah, that is how I read it too. Is I didn't go in order. I just sort of was like, oh, this essay seems interesting for me today. This one, I jumped around, and that is sort of like a really, pleasurable way to make your way through a book. It's just what sparks my interest right now. Let me go, play with this idea for a while. So thank you for choosing it.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Hey.
Where can folks find you if they want to hear more from you?
These days, I haven't successfully quit Instagram, so I'm still on Instagram at Rosianna Holst Rice. I am in theory on YouTube at youtube.com/Rosianna. And what else do I use? I think that might be it. Wow. Oh, TikTok. I'm on TikTok at Rosianna Rojas. And that's been very pleasurable just to put things up and then run away. That's been great.
For sure. Yeah, it's been like that with my my TikTok account, which is not It's Radish Time. I have a different moniker. I'm Goth Croissant.
Yes. It's your alter ego. I love it.
My alter ego, and I'm just gonna talk about music I like, and not be so tied up in all of the 10-year history of being on YouTube, more than 10 years. 12, 13 years. But I'm just like, there's no baggage here.
No. Well, actually, is it the 4th today? Yeah. Today is my, oh goodness. If I started in 2006, what year is this anniversary? 17?
Yeah, 17th anniversary of
today. So
congratulations.
Thank you. It's an honor to spend it with you.
Your YouTube channel could get a temporary driver's learning permit in the US.
Terrific.
You can get a driver's license at 16. I was like,
oh, you can get one in the UK then.
Ah, there you go.
Because we learned it's 17. In theory, my YouTube channel is going to learn to drive before I do, I think. Good. I'm okay with that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Also, before we all leave, this is the last episode of the first season of Hopepunk Book Club. So thank you to everyone who helped me kind of learn by doing how to run one of these and what it was like. There is a survey in the description, like a Google form in the description of this video. Also, once this is like a not a live stream, we'll pin a comment with the link if you're watching it after the fact. Please leave your feedback as I plan season 2. We'll be on a little bit of a break for a month or 2 as I figure out where we go next. But please leave your feedback so that we can make season 2 even better. And thank you, Rosianna, and thank you everybody who participated. This has been a really wonderful project. Speaking of moving towards community in a way that, unlike my TikTok where I just post a little video and I run away, this has brought me deeper into community with y'all, and it's been really a nice addition to my life.
Yay! Yay. Congratulations, season 1.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye.